Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Unscripted History, where today we'll be going over the Battle of Saltanovka. So, where this battle really starts off at is we see on July 7th, 1812, as Bagration, who is the leader of the Russian forces, is given the order to meet up with the First Western Army of the Russian forces, who is led by this dude by the name of Barclay-de-Tolly, and obviously Bagration rules the Second Western Army, and so we see as they're commanded to join together. And so we see as they begin to progress towards this. And then after that, with this, well, I guess with an intercepting force, we see as the French leader Devoe ultimately ends up coming in and takes the city of Mogilev on July 20th. And the Russians are able to take the front surrounding forces of Mogilev on July 21st. However, they're not actually able to take Mogilev themselves, or Mogilev. And so then after that, we see as a battle is set out. So we see as Bagration ultimately ends up dividing his forces and ends up giving, it's either 17,000 to 20,000 men to Nikolai Revsky, who ends up leading a predominant, portion of the Russian forces in this battle. And he is tasked with either beating the French forces and then taking the city of Orsha so that it can be defended and cover Bagration's eventual move south toward Mogilev, south of Mogilev, to join up with Barclay de Tolly, whatever his name was. And he's either left to do that, or he's told that, you need to defend and keep the French back long enough to where Bagration can go south of Mogilev and then once again meet up, I guess, in a more perilous circumstance. Now we see that Devoe here is just trying to take and beat down the Russians. And here with Devoe, we see that he has around, it's stated either 21,500 or 28,000 troops, but it's more likely 28,000 because it's presumed that there was 22,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. And so this is the numbers we have. So the battle begins on July 23rd, 1812. And we see as the first actions start at 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock respectively. And with these, we actually see that the Russians start off the battle going pretty strong. They're able to beat back the French forces quite well. However, this does not last long, because we see that first the big, battle, predominant conflict starts at Fatova, which is around the area. And we see as Devoe has to send in some forces to end up facing this dude by the name of Paskevich, who ends up giving him a run for his money. We see as ultimately Devoe ends up coming in with his troops first and is able to do well here. However, Paskevich ends up coming in, I believe, with 12 artillery guns and starts bombing them down. However, we then see as the French end up taking ground once more, and then Paskevich takes it, and we just kind of see this back and forth continually. And so this struggle is happening, but what is also happening simultaneously is the actual battle at Saltanovka. And this battle at Saltanovka is considered the predominant portion of this battle, and it is far less in favor of the Russians. We see as Ravisky is... Ravisky, oh my gosh, these damn Russian names are very difficult to get out. Nikolai Ravisky is fighting with Devoe's troops. And he does very poorly because he ends up missing the command to start firing his artillery. So they just get absolutely bombarded. They get obliterated to the point where Ravisky ultimately ends up leading a charge with his 11 and 16-year-old son, which failed, obviously. So we see as ultimately with Devoe winning this, he essentially wins the whole battle, even with the contention with Paskevich. Oh my gosh. Paskevich. There we are. So we see ultimately as the battle ends up going to Devoe. Now, this is considered a French victory because, they did win, and they did end up taking more of the Russians than they took of them, because we see at the end of the battle that 2,584 Russians were accounted for as being dead. Now, the French casualties are very debated. We see at first that Devoe ultimately ended up reporting that he had around 4,000 dead. However, that is much so not the case, and he later admitted he believed he only had 900 wounded and 100 killed, but it's likely estimated the amount of casualties was about 1,200 individuals. So that combines wounded, prisoners, and dead, obviously. So, they did technically end up winning. However, they did not stop what the Russians were planning on doing, because after this, we see as Bagration ultimately was able to move the rest of his forces down south of Mogilev, built a bridge, crossed the Dnieper, which had been his goal the entire time, and then ends up reaching the city of Solminska, I believe it was what it's called, and he ends up reaching this city and combines his force with Barclays, and they are able to achieve their goal here. But ultimately, the French did end up winning. They were able to take not really a majority of the Russian forces, but they were able to do a pretty penny. Like I said, they had about 20,000 people, so about a tenth of their forces were taken here. So that's a pretty good win on the French's side. Now, when I was first reading this, I really didn't think the French were going to win because, well, I knew they were probably going to win considering that they had a higher number of men. However, like that first, well, not necessarily the first encounter because the encounter with Paskevich was a little bit later on at Fatova. However, it was very contentious. Like I said, it was very back and forth. So I was like, dang, they might do good. And then I saw the absolute blunder that Revitsky had at Saltanovka, and it kind of just went all downhill from there. But yeah, that's just kind of a little, I guess, anecdote from the larger 1812 invasion of Russia by France and Napoleon. And I just kind of wanted to talk about it because I've been reading War and Peace, and I read at one point where this person had lied up and said it was the Thermopylae of Russia. And I mean, yeah, it has some similarities with them escaping and ultimately living to see another day. However, it was not as important as Thermopylae, but it was just a cool little battle I liked researching up on and wanted to share with y'all. So that's all it really is for this episode of Unscripted History, so thank you very much for watching.